At all times, first and foremost, we have the job of keeping the lights on. We are reinventing our industry. It is a transition, and it takes a lot of creativity, it takes a lot of innovation. I think the key challenge I see for the industry is sort of separating the signal from the noise.
Data center and AI, not only creeping up on us, it's upon us.
Over 26,000 megawatts of new clean energy resources onto the grid in the last 5 years. Over the last 10, 11 years, we've been able to save electricity consumers across the West over $7.5 billion in production cost savings. Technology is coming onto the grid faster than ever.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Watt and Why podcast. I'm Mike Smith. I am your host for today's episode, and we've got some really good stuff for you today. When you look at what's happening in our energy and utility landscape, one of the things that's really emerging is what is the role of the independent system operator, and how is that evolving as the grid evolves, as the regulatory climate evolves, to some degree as the political climate evolves. But I think there's some really interesting dynamics here that we're going to dive in today, and boy, do we have a great guest today to dive into that with. We have Elliot Mainzer, who is the CEO of the California ISO, which is here in Folsom in Northern California, which also happens to be where I'm based. Before we dive in with Elliot, let me just give you a little bit about his background. He's been the CEO of CAISO since September of 20. Prior to that, he spent 18 years at Bonneville Power, where he was the administrator and CEO for 7 of those years. He has an undergrad degree from Berkeley and an MBA and a master's degree in environmental management from Yale. So he's got some really interesting credentials and background that he brought to bear when he joined CAISO. And he's been there, I guess this month is 5 years. So what an exciting 5 years it's been, Elliot. I would like to start with kind of a high-level question and just talk to you a little bit about the good, the bad, and the ugly of the energy transition. I think we're all somewhere between up to our knees and up to our eyeballs in energy transition. And there's a lot of interesting things happening, a lot of positive developments, but certainly some challenges. So from where you sit running an ISO, what are your observations about where we are at this stage in the energy transition?
Well, thanks, Mike. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. You know, I get versions of that question a lot, and it is always a very interesting perspective to be working for an independent system operator where sort of the physics and the economics of the energy transition come together right in real time. You see the grid operating and you see it adapting to these changes. And a lot of times you hear people use this analogy of sort of flying the plane while you're rebuilding it at the same time. And it really is pretty apt for the energy transition because we at all times, first and foremost, we have the job of keeping the lights on, maintaining reliability, but you have this changing resource base, you have changing market design, you have changing politics, you have changing transmission topology. And of course, we now have this variable of extreme weather, whether it's super hot summers or super crazy cold winters that we have to deal with at the same time. And so managing all those changes and doing them reliably and increasingly affordably, I mean, rates are a big issue for utilities across the country. We're very sensitive to that, even at the ISO, where we don't necessarily, do rate making. I think the bottom line is that, I think in general, the industry is doing a pretty good job. I mean, just here in California, we've brought over 26,000 megawatts of new clean energy resources onto the grid in the last 5 years, including over 13,000 megawatts of batteries. We have load growth, we have data centers, we have all these changes. We've had extreme weather. We've got the emergence of distributed energy resources. And I think generally the state's doing a pretty good job managing the transition. Just the last 3 years, we've had, again, really hot summers, hot winters. We've been able to start stabilizing the grid with new supply. These batteries now, these 4-hour lithium-ion batteries are incredible. They mop up a lot of, extra energy during the middle of the day, turn it back into the grid in the evening when it's still hot during sunset. And of course, we're approving a lot of new transmission and getting the grid built out. So those are the positive things. I think at the same time, there are hiccups, right? I mean, at the end of the day, when you get into record peak demand, when you get into record cold, there's a lot of moving parts. We've got wildfires. And so there are still some stressful moments on the grid, not just in California, but across the country. And those are times when you've got to really double down on communication to make sure your partners and the utilities and the state agencies know what's going on. You have to sometimes use non-conventional tools to keep the lights on. And so that's been challenging. And I think also the industry, with all the changes, I think across the country, people are really recognizing, it takes a village to run a grid, right? The ISOs have really important responsibilities, right? But the states and the load serving entities also have really, really important responsibilities in terms of planning, in terms of resource adequacy, in terms of load forecasting. And so in order to maintain reliability, this is really about collaboration and about partnership and making sure you've got a clear sense of the requisite roles and responsibilities of the state agencies, the load serving entities, and the ISOs, because we all have to work together to keep the lights on. That's something, quite frankly, I'm pretty proud of here in California. I think we work really, really effectively now with the Public Utilities Commission, with the Energy Commission, with the load serving entities, with the community choice aggregators, the public power utilities, the new technology service providers. And of course, as the operator of the Western Energy Imbalance Market, we also have to work with about 80% of the utilities across the West to support each other during extreme weather events. So it's definitely a challenging transition, but I generally feel like we're making a lot of really good progress.
That's a lot. I think most people, when they hear about an ISO, think they're the grid operators. But I think you've just given a glimpse into how complex that is. I wanted to talk with you a little bit about some of the things you talked about, but maybe dive in a little deeper. One is, I think we're seeing increasing load, right? Increasing demand. A lot of that, of course, is data centers. A lot of that is electrification and EVs. And when I've talked with people about that before, there's often the analogy of, well, we've handled massive growth before, like in the 60s and 70s when we had air conditioning coming online and we figured that out. So we're kind of doing the same thing again. To that, I say, okay, but we weren't necessarily reinventing the way we generated and delivered energy in the 60s and 70s. So I think that is a big challenge. And I want to ask a few questions coming off that. You mentioned the Western Energy Imbalance Market. I think that's going to be something that is super important and maybe we don't fully appreciate it yet. And as we were prepping for this call, one of the terms that I mentioned to you that I came up with is resource diversity and transmission capacity. Those are two things that are so critical in this new landscape. Can you speak a little bit to how the Western Energy Imbalance Market is going to provide more of that diversity and more of that capacity? Because those are two things I think as an industry we're struggling with.
Great question. We were fortunate over 10 years ago in the West. The CAISO was established in the late 1990s, and we sort of built out an energy market. And by the early part of the 2010s, other utilities and resource developers across the West were starting to see a lot of the growth in renewables, more weather volatility, more uncertainty. And CAISO was able to say, look, we've built a real-time energy market. We have the computer telemetry. We've got the systems. We can extend that market to your systems at relatively low cost. And back in 2014, PacifiCorp was the first entity to join that market, bringing a big chunk of resource diversity from Utah and Wyoming and Oregon and Washington into the system. And over the last 10, 11 years, that market has grown to encompass about 80% of the utilities across the Western United States. And it's been able to take advantage, to your point, of the transmission connectivity that links big parts of the Western United States and the resource diversity, right? The renewable resources of California, the hydro resources of the Pacific Northwest, the natural gas and other technology in the Intermountain West, and really, really solid transmission connectivity between those regions. It's sort of the theory of having a grid that's bigger than the weather. And by leveraging that transmission connectivity and that resource diversity over the last 10, 11 years, we've been able to save electricity consumers across the West over $7.5 billion in production cost savings. It's been really, really important for supporting each other during extreme weather events, whether they're super hot summers or super cold winters in the Intermountain West. And we've also been able to, significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions by over 1 million metric tons, right? So this has been a key part of the affordability and reliability and environmental sustainability equation. We're now in the process of building out an extended day-ahead market on the sort of the platform of the Western Energy Imbalance Market. And it's been great. We're starting to see a number of really great new partners signing up to join that market, and we're planning to go live actually with our first market participant, PacifiCorp, in the spring of 2026. So that you're exactly right. Managing grids by taking advantage of diversity of resources, transmission connectivity, wide area dispatch, pooling resources, sharing capability during extreme weather events. Those have just become fundamental principles of good utility management and a tool that's been super helpful for us here at CAISO.
Yeah, it's pretty neat and it's pretty new and different. And I think that as an industry, we're going to be watching to see how that continues to evolve. We all hear about AI and data centers and all of that, and this has come up in some of the previous episodes of the Watt and Why podcast. Let me ask you this: what's your biggest concern as you step back and you look at exploding demand around AI and data centers and some of the changes to that landscape and how it's going to get done? And then I had a couple corollary follow-up questions, but that whole idea of, again, the term I landed on was resource diversity and transmission capacity. I love seeing that handled at massive scale, yet at the same time we have this data center and AI demand just, it's not only creeping up on us, it's upon us.
Well, and certainly managing the grid in California, where a lot of these technologies first emerged, right? We're already in the process of building out the transmission grid in the Silicon Valley area to accommodate the growth of data centers. I think the key challenge I see for the industry is sort of separating the signal from the noise, right? I mean, our industry has a little bit of a history going back many, many years of kind of sort of over forecasting or under forecasting. So I think the key thing right now is, trying to get a handle on just exactly how big is the demand curve. How will the technology service providers adapt? What will the energy density and the energy consumption patterns of artificial intelligence of data centers look like 5, 6, 7 years from now? And how do we get a good handle on that? Ground truth, the load forecasts that are maybe being done at the higher level by the agencies with the on the ground experience of the utilities, and get a really good handle on just how big the demand is going to be. Make sure that we're getting the transmission infrastructure, the interconnection rules, and also the cost allocation methodologies in place so that consumers don't bear a disproportionate burden here as these resources come on the system. Making sure we've got a healthy portfolio of resources that are available to serve them so we don't degrade resource adequacy in the areas where they're coming on the system fairly quickly. And then also, I think it's really incumbent, and I'm encouraged that to see the sort of the data center industry responding here, at least being constructively engaged, is these resources are going to have to bring some flexibility to the grid, right? There's quite a bit of transmission connectivity in many systems. There's a lot of resource under many conditions, but many of our grids have 50, 70, 100 hours a year where you start putting another 4, 5, 6, 7,000 megawatts of generation of demand on that system, and you're really stressing these grids out. And so they've got to bring some dispatchable capability and some flexibility to help support reliability under stress grid events. And I think that's incumbent upon this very sophisticated industry. Let's apply some artificial intelligence to how to make AI data centers more flexible and to be good grid citizens in the places that they come on board.
Exactly. And I think the whole AI, not just as something driving load, but AI as part of the solution. I think that's a future episode of the Watt and Why that we're working on. So I hear you there. Let me ask you 3 questions, one at a time, about ways that as I watch the news and as I listen, that may be part of the solution to this exploding demand. That's the term I use. Maybe that's not the right term, but that's what I call it. Number 1, behind the meter generation. I think that touches on part of what you were describing there in terms of these large, hyperscalers, et cetera, that are driving a lot of this demand, building on-site generation. Where are you seeing that? I've seen some examples of that. There was one that came out in the news last week. It was almost a full gigawatt. It was 966 megawatts somewhere in the Midwest at a data center that they've said, we're going to do it. So how do you see that fitting into the whole schema of, as you look at like the Western Energy Imbalance Market?
Yeah, that's interesting. I probably don't see that issue as being so much directly related to the EIM, although certainly to the extent to which the energy imbalance market is helpful in managing extreme tails of resource distributions, extreme events and supporting reliability, it will help under those conditions. And data centers also being part of the flexibility equation, they're related. But that that local issue of co-location of resources, understanding the allocation of transmission capacity, understanding the need to continue to support resource adequacy. Those are a unique set of issues. We haven't seen quite as much of that in the California footprint right now, but we're certainly watching that issue nationally, seeing how FERC will end up treating those issues from a cost allocation and interconnection basis, and seeing just how much new capability and what type of technologies these folks can actually bring onto the system. I think we all know that, the supply chains for new generation are tight. There's lots of, sort of forward looks on small modular nuclear reactors and things like that. The question is, how quickly can they bring this new technology on board so that they're not overly taxing systems that are already, I would say, bearing some significant burdens in terms of resource adequacy. So it's something we're definitely watching, and to the extent to which the Western Energy Imbalance Market and our extended day-ahead market can, back to your previous points, pool diversity, take advantage of transmission connectivity and help support reliability under extreme events, that will take some additional pressure off the system and create more room for new resources coming on the grid.
That's kind of the kernel of what I was getting at. And I heard you say two things that I think are going to decide this pretty quickly. And one is, how fast can they do it? Because I think part of their value proposition is when a developer goes in and says, we're not regulated like a utility. We can come in and we can do this much faster for you. So, Mr. or Ms. Data Center Manager, we're going to partner with you. We're going to meet all your needs. And so I think the quickly thing is number one. Number two is the regulatory compact that we've resided in for so long. I think that's going to change, and it's going to be interesting to see how flexible that can be, because there's these established paradigms of how you generate and deliver electricity, and it's being turned on its head as we speak.
Mike, I think you're putting your finger on such an important set of issues. In California, as you probably know, we've done a lot of work to reform our interconnection queuing processes, right? This is another one of these issues across the country. We had several 100,000 megawatts of resources lined up in our queue. And just last year, we went back to FERC with a package of significant reforms in how we are going to onboard resources into our study process. And one of the elements of that, and we've now put these reforms are actually approved by FERC last October. We put them immediately into production. They're already helping us sort of separate out the best projects, the most eligible projects, the projects that are best aligned with our transmission planning for studying purposes. But we've also created space for the hyperscalers to come into that process and be part of the solution, because they are large loads. They have responsibility, right? They have resource adequacy impacts. And so bringing them in, making sure that they can, partner with new generation and even help get projects to the interconnection queue is something that we're definitely looking at, because we want them to be able to be effective and accountable grid stewards.
Yeah. And it's interesting also, if you look at kind of the organizational culture of a utility, compare it to the organizational culture of a Google or a Meta, right? So, utility, more operational excellence focused. Raw materials in, product out, do it reliably, safely, efficiently. A Google or a hyperscaler comes in, we're all about innovation and speed. And I'm looking to see how these two are going to mesh together, because I think we're seeing some of that now. And I think that's one reason why we're seeing some of these things, like we're going to co-locate generation on site with our data center, and we'll partner with you, but we can't wait for you. We just can't.
I love that. If I could just respond to something, because you just identified two themes: innovation and speed, which I think are going to be central, quite frankly, to the evolution of the ISO in 5 years. So you may not traditionally associate evolution and speed with, or sort of innovation and speed with utilities, and maybe more with the Googles and the Metas, but those are very important attributes. And so, when we start applying artificial intelligence to the way that we manage outages on our grid, or when we bring new programs to process interconnection queue requests on our system, or when we reinvent the way the market design has to operate for batteries, or we look at new and innovative financing models for transmission, all of those things have to be part of a strategy of innovation and speed, getting resources onto the system as efficiently and as timely as we can, because the economic pressures, the affordability pressures, And for us, first and foremost, the reliability pressures are so extreme that we've got to take that friction out of the system. And so those are really good principles to apply. We've really embraced those here at the CAISO.
Happy to hear that, and I'll be interested to watch it. And of course, I have a vested interest being here in Folsom. Two things I wanted to touch base with you on, and then I wanted to come back something very specific to CAISO, and that is what you've seen. You're kind of at this 5-year inflection point, what that's looked like, and then maybe 5 years forward. But first, I wanted your thoughts on two areas. One was nuclear. I'm sure you've seen that TVA said they're going to go ahead with 6 gigawatts of small modular reactors. We've seen plants that are either extended or restarted in Michigan, Pennsylvania, California, and Iowa. This morning I read that Reuters reported 7 gigawatts of increased nuclear capacity will come online in the U.S. by the end of the decade. Looks like nuclear is a growing part of the mix. How do you see that rolling out either within the CAISO territory or the Western Energy Imbalance Market?
Yeah, great question. So I've been around nuclear resources through my entire career. When I was at BPA, we dispatched the Columbia Generating Station out in the Tri-Cities of Washington. Of course, in California, we've got the Diablo Canyon Nuclear Plant. I think both of these resources have been very, very important parts of the reliability and quite frankly, the sustainability equation in terms of climate emissions, things for a long time. And so I am quite interested and intrigued to see the developments that are happening in the small modular nuclear patch. I think that's going to be really interesting to watch what happens across the country. I don't think you're going to see California be the center of innovation. I think California will probably watch and observe that a little bit more. We've got our, existing nuclear plant that's on sort of an extended life for a number of years. But I do think that there's going to be a lot of learnings. I think the pressures on energy density and on emissions management, ultimately affordability and scalability, are going to continue to be big parts of the equation. Obviously, we do have the big opportunities associated with artificial intelligence and getting, the hyperscalers on the grid. So I think it's going to be part of the equation. I don't see that being a big part of the transition here in California in the next few years, but the next several, I know our Public Utilities Commission, our state entities, our utilities are watching very carefully, and we're excited to see how things play out.
Yeah, me too. I just think there's a lot of promise there. And when you, as I like to say, when you do the math, nuclear's got to be somewhere in that mix. So, all right. The other one I wanted to ask you about before we get to kind of your perspectives on CAISO itself is around virtual power plants. I'm by no means an expert here, but I've done a little bit of work in the space, and it's super interesting. The ability to scale something so quickly and come online so quickly for peaking events and other types of emergency events. There's been some legislation recently in California that some of it is pushing the envelope forward on virtual power plants. Some of it is pulling it back a little bit in terms of requiring utilities to integrate virtual power plants into their grid investment plans. So it's not necessarily mandated, but it's certainly a dispatchable resource that's growing. How do you see that fitting in, again, to that resource diversity mix?
I think it's a really important part of the equation. I mean, when you go back and you look at the load duration curves, right? When you look at the way that electricity demand is arrayed across time, and you see that there's just a relatively small number of hours across the course of the year that can drive significant increases in demand. And you think about the economics of what it costs to build capacity and dispatch energy and the reliability implications of that last, 5, 6, 7, 8,000 megawatts of demand. There is a lot of value on the table. So to the extent to which virtual power plants, distributed energy resources can bring some load reduction to the table under those particular circumstances, it is very valuable. I think California, Australia, other parts of the world, other parts of the country, Texas, we're all still grappling, I think, to really settle on the right combination of economics and cost allocation and price signals, automation, customer behavior, business model. It's still very much a work in progress. We're quite interested in that issue here at the CAISO because we watch the grid operate under these distressed conditions. And I can tell you just, several weeks ago when the California Energy Commission ran the latest test of that nice stack of virtual power plant capability that's administered to the demand side grid support program, you could see several hundred megawatts of dispatchable capability coming off the system. That's really valuable. It's a very important part of the equation going forward. But we've got to get the business case and the pricing and the cost allocation right so that the consumer is truly benefiting and that you're actually improving affordability. I think that's the thing we're still driving for. And we're watching this very carefully. Actually, by the end of this year, we're hoping to have a clear understanding. We're planning to have a clear understanding of just what are some of the additional actions that CAISO can take to help support the load flexibility side of the equation.
Yeah, and it's as you were describing that, we're describing one sliver of kind of the energy mix, right? And just the complexity just of this alone, before you even think about integrating it into the bigger picture, it's kind of mind-boggling. I've been in the industry for 35 years, and I think 15 years ago, I don't think we were talking about these things to the degree that we are today, and it is a little bit mind-boggling. The other thing I'll just mention is that affordability piece. I'm very fortunate in that in my role in any given month, I talk to dozens of utilities, and I have yet to find one within the last 18 months that does not have some sort of affordability initiative. So ultimately, other than reliability, this may be what drives us forward. And I think there'll be some good things to come out of that, as painful as it may be. I do want to ask you a little bit about your tenure as CEO at CAISO. So you've had 5 years. Things have changed a lot in 5 years. So maybe just reflect on that a little bit, particularly around the changing role of CAISO during your tenure there, and maybe just a little bit of a crystal ball looking 5 years forward. So what do those two things look like from where you're sitting, and give us a sense of how it's evolved and where it might be going?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. When I look back on the last 5 years, I think for me, first and foremost, I see everything we do has to be done through a collaboration model, has to be done through partnerships, right? And I feel really positive. I feel very fortunate to have come into California at a time when partnership and collaboration was really, really important. So working with the state agencies, the local regulatory authorities, working with all the different utilities, the different types of load serving entities, working with the technology service providers, working with folks in the environmental community, working with all of our different partners across the Western United States to continue building out the EIM and the extended day-ahead market. I feel really good about those. And that partnership has gotten us in a position where today we are just in so much better situated from a resource adequacy perspective than we were 5 years ago. Again, 26,000 megawatts of new generation, the nation's largest fleet of lithium-ion batteries, over $21 billion of new transmission approved, great partnerships with adjacent states, some big interregional transmission lines coming into production out into New Mexico and up into Wyoming, working with our partners in the Intermountain West. There's just so much there. And also, we've really invested in our control center. We've given our operators a whole new set of tools to help them with state awareness to manage extreme events. And I think we've just generally kind of brought a much more of sort of a partnership and collaborative stakeholder engagement model to the way that we, as a very sort of engineering centric organization, have traditionally done things. We've also, I think, learned how to navigate some of the political issues a little bit more effectively. The bottom line is, we are not a state agency. We do not set policy for the state of California on its resource choices, nor do we set policy for any other state. So we sort of think of ourselves as the Department of Physics and Economics that is able to kind of ride over the top of all this resource development and bring efficiency and effective dispatch, and at the end of the day, reliability. And by bending the curve on bringing new resources on board effectively, by taking friction out of our interconnection queuing process, by doing effective long-term transmission planning, and then by really doing a good job running the Western energy market and also operating the RC, we feel like we can drive for that important affordability variable, which I think is just, like you said, critical for all utilities. So I feel really good about that. I feel like we've made a lot of progress. I think going forward, you touched on a lot of the challenges. I really appreciate your perspective, Mike. You've obviously seen the landscape, the next several years, managing that load growth. And really getting a good handle on it, figuring out the right resource portfolio that's going to keep the lights on, but also continue, carrying the flag for environmental sustainability, which is, important to all the utilities. I think figuring out the right business model so these virtual power plants and distributed energy resources can actually participate in the dispatch and bring value to the system. And then, of course, one of my favorite was just continuing to attract great people to our industry. One of my favorite parts about working the CAISO is we just have I just really love the people I work with. The folks I came in, the folks we've attracted, and the next generation. I think somebody told me we had a statistic, and I'm not sure if this is a commentary on the job market or just automation. But last summer, in actually 2024, we had 28,000 applications for 30 summer internship positions, right? And we attracted this incredible group of young people coming in who are just like so totally motivated to roll up their sleeves and help solve these problems. I just love that. I get inspiration out of that because, kind of going back to your first question, we are reinventing our industry. It is a transition, and it takes a lot of creativity, takes a lot of innovation, takes that speed, and it takes a lot of partnership. It takes people who are really willing to step up to the table with kind of a good sense of humility and accountability to try to solve problems, and then to actually enjoy the process of working collaboratively with others. So I think the next 5 years are going to be amazing. The speed of the transition is going to accelerate in a lot of different ways. Technology is coming out of the grid faster than ever. And at the CAISO, we just love being part of these two worlds. We have a set of responsibilities that we take very seriously, longstanding responsibilities for the state of California that we do over here. And then we also have this role as a regional services operator of operating the Western Energy Imbalance Market. And we're excited to see the way that market is operated, the growth of EDAM, the evolution of governance, and the partnerships of the other states. I think these two things are going to develop in parallel with each other, and we're going to be super well positioned for a lot of interesting and very valuable work in the years ahead. And I just appreciate your interest, appreciate everything you guys do at Energy Central, and it's cool to see your perspective on the industry as well.
Well, thank you. And boy, it is an interesting time. I think we've both been in it a long time, and we can see how things have been turned on their head in some cases. Department of Physics and Economics, I'm going to borrow that from you and use that. I love that, because you get into the regulatory and the legislative environment, and at some point they run into the realities of economics and physics, and I love that. So that's great. So on that note, I'll say thanks again. I really appreciate you taking the time with us today. And since we're both located here in Folsom, I hope to see you somewhere out on the trails or out on Sutter Street sometime. And we'll look forward to connecting again soon.
That'd be great, Mike. Thanks again for having me today, and best to you and your team.
All right. Thanks so much. And thanks everybody for joining us.